hosting us. As you mentioned, I am a native of Southbridge, and I've been a history professor for a long time and worked on lots of different places, Mexico, Costa Rica. But I think like all historians, I eventually just come back to my hometown, because that's what really matters to you, and that's what you know the best, even though you might have kind of wandered off into other places. So it's been amazing to kind of work on this book, because I love Southbridge and I love the people, and I think I've reconnected with all of my high school friends who I haven't talked to, and some of them in 30 years, but now I am. So this is David Thornton. He and I got to know each other because he's also at EWU in the history program, and he joined me as part of a research team last summer where we did a lot of oral interviews, and we talked to folks in community groups. And I think before we even get into this, the one thing about Southbridge, which you all know, but needs to be said, is that we have an incredible story, which makes us, quote, not your run-of-the-mill mill town. So there's a lot of stuff about Southbridge which is typical of kind of a factory town in America. But there's also all kinds of things which make us completely unique. And I really want to tell those stories building on the greatness of people like my cousin John Moore, who's written history, Steve Brady, others whose work has inspired kind of what we do. And a lot of people have written the history of Southbridge, and you might hear about some of them tonight in this talk. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of tales, and then I'll pass it over to Dave, who's going to blow your mind. So one thing that's really interesting is I grew up in Southbridge, and Southbridge is incredibly tribal. It's rooted around things like churches and community groups. And I'd always known that the French Canadians, came from Canada, were the kind of largest ethnic group growing up in the 70s, in the 80s and 90s. But I didn't really realize the kind of importance of that group until I really started researching it. So in 1895, this is the late 19th century is a period of nativism. There's a lot of hostility toward immigrants, specifically Catholic immigrants. There's a fear that the Romanists, right, the Roman Catholics have taken over urban America, that they're kind of forcing their religion, their language, their culture upon these kind of old Yankee towns. They would have used words like, on a kind of good, wholesome Yankee town like Southbridge. So there's a lot of attacks on Catholic immigrants, Romanists they call them. So a story we came across which is incredible, it's also hilarious if you're from Southbridge, because as these things are in hindsight, although they have echoes of today, which you might notice, is the story that surrounds the building of Notre Dame Church. So on the corner of what is Marcy and Main Street, used to be an old house. It was the home of Colonel Moses Marcy, he's up in the top left there. Beautiful old white frame farmhouse. He built it in 1736. This was just a couple years after coming to town. His descendants are born there. Most famously is William Learned Marcy. I believe this must have been his grandson, maybe great-grandson. He's born in the late 1700s, lives through into about the 1860. Fast forward to 1880s, and the house is in complete disrepair. It needs paint. It's fallen apart. The Board of Selectmen in Southbridge actually are looking at that site to kind of build the town hall, which will come into existence in the 1880s. But they really want the last kind of remaining Marcy in that house to leave. His name was William A. Marcy. And by all accounts, he's kind of a crusty old guy who's like standing his ground until he dies. So the Board of Selectmen can't get him out of that house. Fast forward a couple more years, and of course they build the town hall here on Elm Street. And a new group wants that site. The French Catholics, who are based in Notre Dame Church, which then is on Pine Street, they want that location. And they're led by I'll come back to this. They're led by a kind of a potent, a kind of fiery priest named Monsignor George Elzion Brochu. So Father Brochu is one of the kind of one of the most forgotten kind of crucial members of the story of Southbridge. There's a Brochu Street. There's an Academy Brochu, which is long since been a French school. But Father Brochu is essential in the story of Southbridge because he's what we now call an ethnic nationalist. He believes in his ethnicity and he wants to push it through. He wants the people of Southbridge to learn French. He wants them to be Catholic. He doesn't tolerate his parishioners going to public schools. In fact, he excommunicates people and then gets sued by them for even leaving the church. So Notre Dame is exploding. By 1895, probably about 3/5, if not 2/3 of the town at this point is now French Canadian. So the French Canadians have swelled and taken over numerically the town. And they're led by an iron fist by Father Brochu. So they're trying to get out Old Man Marcy. And word of this gets out to all of these kind of nativist newspapers, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of papers that hate immigrants and want to kind of promote Yankee America. So a newspaper article in a newspaper called The American, it has kind of inflammatory headlines like this, right? Directly in the heart of the village of Southbridge, an old man is being harassed by young Catholic thugs who are being kind of forced into action by the priest to try to remove them from his old farmhouse. They also talk about how the Catholic students in the public schools aren't standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, how they're biting and attacking their old Puritan teachers. And there's a lot of talk about these French Catholics being driven by this guy, Brochu. So Brochu screws up though. They succeed in having a contract with the Marcy family to buy the lot, which they intend, of course, to throw down the house and build Notre Dame. But they allow him to live in the house until he dies. So 1895, a few years have already passed, many more would pass too, before old man Marcy finally decides to die. And yet even outlives Brochu, who dies in 1904. So there's the newspaper there, The American. It points to Southbridge as like a lot of kind of colonial New England towns that are being, quote, overrun by Romanists, French Catholics. And here you can read some of the quotes, right, of how these boys, again, at the direction of the priest, are trying to force out this old Yankee. This is not Brochu. In fact, this is from St. Mary's parochial school, which in 1895 would have been exclusively Irish. It's impossible to find a picture of Brochu. We've tried. There's probably something in this library here, but I don't know where it is. But we'll keep looking. So what happens is, in time, of course, Marcy died in 1908. There's his gravestone in Oak Ridge Cemetery. Construction begins almost immediately on Notre Dame Church. It takes a few years, but the history of Notre Dame is very interesting. A lot of you know that. Ultimately, this incredible, beautiful monument to kind of this Catholic behemoth is built on Main Street, directly overpowering the old Yankee Church across the street, the First Baptist, Methodist, the Methodist Church, yeah. So if you were a nativist, if you were, a Klansman type or a know-nothing, or if you were kind of someone of that persuasion, this was like your worst nightmare, right? So how these kind of French Catholics kind of taking over this old New England town. Interestingly, they themselves, a few years later, start to complain about the exact same thing, right? Now their town is being overrun by new waves of immigrants who are kind of taking their spots, taking their shops, overwhelming the town politically, not politically, but economically. Felix Catino is someone that people in Southbridge know. As far as I know, it's the only monument to an actual individual that exists in Southbridge. There's monuments to, anonymous soldiers, but this is the one and only person who's commemorated in the town of Southbridge. And he very much was an ethnic nationalist who basically called for the kind of takeover of this place. He called Southbridge a little corner of the province of Quebec. In his book, The Franco-Americans of Southbridge, Massachusetts, he brags about how we've taken over the police chief, we've taken over the fire chief, we've taken over the dog catcher, the overseer of the poor, and we're not done yet. And he's bragging about how this French Canadian takeover is just only starting. So there's going to be ethnic friction with Felix, but he goes into politics in about the 19-teens, and his exact spot is taken over by new waves of migrants now from places like Italy, right? And here you see this corner here. This is a building which I know has very important, very current topic of conversation. An Italian flag flies exactly where Gatineau's store would have been. In a way, that's kind of an ethnic marker that would have kind of pissed off French Canadians who thought that this was our space, and who are you to fly your flag on our block? So this kind of story of immigration and ethnic nationalism continues in Southbridge over and over and over again. These two guys I was really cool to learn about. I didn't know the Sorletto story, but they had a fruit shop. They opened the first car dealership in town. A lot of the stuff I learned from various, fine histories of Southbridge that exist. But let's go back to let's keep that shop in mind. A lot of you know where I'm going with this. Yeah. So, oops. Here we see pictures of people related to some of us, right? Lenti shoe repair store. It's going up, I believe, where the Sorletto's fruit store was. This is 7 to 11 Elm Street. This no longer exists. But this would have been a place of kind of community making, ethnic support and solidarity. But undoubtedly, there's friction with other ethnic groups. There's stories about Italian and, say, Polish mill workers who get off in Fiskdale and Sturbridge and get beaten up by French Canadians who are waiting for them. Who kind of attacked them on really resenting the presence of French and, Italian and Polish workers who they saw that was undermining wages, stealing their jobs. Rhetoric that sounds incredibly familiar. And I'll conclude with this because this is a fantastic picture. Again, thank you, my cousin John, for including this in his book. But this is from 1938. U.S. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. gives a speech, celebrates Southbridge, celebrates this, fine park, which is commemorated, Lenti's fine shoe repair sign in the background. Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. was a renowned nativist, Mason, probably, closet Klansman, who despised one ethnic group above all else, Italians. And he saw them as kind of enemies of America who don't assimilate, don't learn the language, don't vote, and simply kind of suck away the resources of the United States. So things are changing in Southbridge, and it's hard to remember that 40 years before this there would have been friction toward French Canadians who were the rhetoric against them in the 1890s was outrageous. They were seen as illiterate, vermin, all kinds of things that you use to describe animals, not people, right? And again, right, ethnic markers in this cultural change is constant, it's perpetual, it's inevitable. Places that were dear to one ethnic group might be taken over by a different ethnic group later on. It's just the way that the world is. It's not new, and it continues to happen to this day. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my research partner here, Dave Thornton.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to have 2 stories today, but they both revolve around gold. And so before we talk about the gold brick case, I want to talk to you about the Olds family. So Alonzo Olds, this story starts in the 1840s. So Alonzo is a tailor's apprentice in the early 1840s, not from Southbridge, but he marries Southbridge gal, Fidelia. They have two children, Frank. Frank is the one we're going to talk about the most. But Alonzo, around when Frank is 2 years old, he decides to go in search of gold in California. So he's one of maybe 20, 25 Massachusetts residents who leave Massachusetts, take the long sailing journey to California and San Francisco to go in search of gold. He's gone for 4 years in search of his fortune and gold nuggets. He has ups and downs, but he comes back to Southbridge with $7,000 worth of gold that he obtained. He goes to work briefly for Jacob Edwards, but then opens up his own tailor shop, which he operates until the mid-1890s. Now, his son Frank, he enlists in the Navy, is born and raised in Southbridge, goes to work for the AO in the gold department, and the AO had suffered gold going missing since 1850s. So you will find several stories in newspapers about gold going missing and the mishandling of gold. So this is just one of the stories of where some employees of AO are accused of taking gold. In this particular case, the police confront 4 different people on the 3rd floor of the AO building. Frank is reported to have confessed, but we weren't able to find any information that actually say he did confess. Frank is not pleased about being confronted, so he actually jumps out of the third floor window and escapes across the Quinebaug River. Frank makes it to Worcester, but about 3 days later, he's apprehended and brought back to Southbridge. They all go before a grand jury, but before that grand jury can actually, a trial can actually be held, Frank falls into a pretty dire state. So he's lost his job at the AO. He's got a very young family. He's got 2 young boys, an Alonzo and Leo Olds. His wife is Rosa Olds, but later went by Rose, a longtime Southbridge resident, and went to St. Mary's. So Frank falls in kind of a dire state, and falls into alcoholism. So this is January 1884, so about 6 months after he's been caught in Worcester, returned, and he's waiting his trial. He's arrested for public drunkenness with another man, while the other man that he's with actually has $56 on him and a gold watch. So the local police officer offers, hey, do you want to just bail out, go home tonight? The man says, yes, absolutely. Police officer goes away to do some paperwork, comes back, yells out Wood's name. But Woods is asleep, so Frank says, yes, I am Woods. Please release me. So the police officer hands him the balance of the bail and the gold watch. Frank proceeds to go ahead and use that money for more alcohol. He's rearrested the very next day for public drunkenness. He's described as like very bright, brilliant. Unfortunately, faced with the upcoming, faced with what he's now facing in terms of what he did the previous day, unfortunately, Frank is found hanging in his jail cell the very next day. So incredibly tragic ending for Frank. And so this story is relatively easy to find in old newspapers and census data. Now, Frank leaves Rosa and 2 sons, Alonzo and Leo. They remain in Southbridge. So this is Frank's son, Alonzo Olds. Alonzo's born and raised in Southbridge, goes to St. Mary's, decides to go into the priesthood, joins the Baltimore Diocese first, and then later becomes the pastor, father, and Monsignor of St. Augustine's in Washington, D.C., which is referred to as the mother of all Black Catholic churches. So Alonzo Olds becomes an early ally to the civil rights movement. He oversees the ordainment of several Black Catholic priests. He's an early supporter of creating Boy Scout troops for the Black community. At the time of his death, he was the only Monsignor to serve his entire career with one single parish. And so I wanted to start the story with something that's kind of grounded in where this gold story goes, because the gold, AO was having an issue with gold and loss of gold stock for a while. And most of these stories would start with AO executives report loss of gold. So E.M. Merritt, Robert Cole's brother, is actually forced out as treasurer because there's lots of complaints about E. Merritt Cole's waste and negligence with the gold stock as treasurer. So he's forced to sell his 40 shares to the group. George W. Wells takes over as treasurer, and somehow this mysterious loss of gold continues, even under George W. So this next part of the story is the gold brick case. And this is much, much harder to find information on. And I have tried, so if anybody has information, it would be fantastic to add to this story. In 1994, the IRS published an internal book, so it's not for the public, it's only published internally for employees, and it's the history of their criminal investigations of the IRS. What I'm blown away about is that in this book, there is a story about the American Optical Company, in which they were asked to pay a fine of over $900,000 to the IRS for tax evasion. So what this case describes is that the three brothers, the triumvirate, had a scheme going where gold borings, gold dust, scrap metal, scrap gold was accumulated, remelted down into 1,000-ounce bars, which would be about 60-pound bars of gold. Those bars of gold would then be redistributed to the three brothers outside of their normal salaries. So for context, and I'm not equating the two, Al Capone around the same time paid a $250,000 back taxes and a $50,000 fine. So the reason why it's really hard to find information about this case is that at the time, these cases were all handled by the Treasury Department, and there were no public appeals. So this conversation with AO and the Wells family would have happened behind closed doors, and likely would have never been published until the IRS wants to tell their own story. And so what happens, I kind of wanted to cooperate and trying to find some information to kind of bring this together. In 2019, the IRS published another version of this story, much shorter, but again, kind of giving the same amount of information. The only newspaper reference to this story is by Walter Winchell, who had a kind of a gossip column, a nationally published gossip column. The person on the right is Elmer Ire. He was the head of the Treasury IRS Criminal Investigations Department, so he's the one that gets credit for bringing down Al Capone, Huey Long, the long list of kind of famous tax dodgers. So Elmer is retiring in 1947, and he wants to write a book about all of his exploits. So he goes to Walter Winchell to publish a story about all of his famous cases. And one case that's mentioned in this article in 1947 is that the American Optical Company was caught in a scheme to melt down gold bars, and they were redistributed to individual owners of the biz. Now, they don't name those individual owners by name, but we all kind of know who they are. And so, unfortunately, so this article goes out nationwide. The union representative up in the Buffalo market of AO starts to send telegrams to AO, and they're published later in this story, pleading for at least one bar of gold to go to the St. Louis AO office for additional wages. Love and kisses. So this story did get out there very briefly. It was only it only ran in papers from October 31st to about November 9th. I checked the library here. It was not published in the Southbridge. 1947.
When was the scheme?
So it most likely happened and was discovered when Alfred Cole sued the individual brothers of AO. So in 1912, the Wells brothers organized a board meeting to basically, they own 77% of the company at this point. Alfred Cole, the son of Robert Cole, owns 23%. They call a board meeting and essentially say, we're going to do a voluntary association, and we're going to vote to have you go ahead and sell your shares to us. this is the Wells attempt to basically incorporate AO as a family trust. So from day one, George W. was trying to buy AO, all of the stock. So Ruth talks about this process in the book. Her self-published book, she talks about this process of George W. trying to buy up all the stock. But this case actually becomes pretty significant in Massachusetts. So ultimately, after it's appealed, the Massachusetts Supreme Court rules in favor of Cole, that essentially the Wellses had fraudulently been devaluing the company on purpose in order to buy up the stocks from the other stockholders. So during this process, Alfred was able to hire an auditor. They did an audit, and it was nearly impossible to determine how much the Wells had withdrawn during that period that were above and beyond the salaries that the shareholders had agreed to. So taking consideration, this is like 1916, 1917. So in 1917, they finally buy out Alfred for a little over $1 million for his remaining shares. And that's when AO becomes a completely Wells-owned family. But in this Massachusetts Supreme Court case, the Wellses never denied or made an argument that those things didn't happen. So the Massachusetts Supreme Court basically accepted Alfred Cole's allegations as true. This case is cited in Massachusetts and across the country by shareholder stock lawsuits up until the 1970s. So it's a pretty significant case that comes out of this, where basically the justices decided that shares of a company have intrinsic value beyond just the value that you can buy and sell them. And so it's a really valuable court case up until the 1970s. So just kind of, to bring my story to an end, this is my favorite Wells spending example that should have raised maybe a red flag in terms of additional income that wasn't part of their normal salaries. So Mrs. Channing Wells, I believe she had a sister in Iowa, so they would travel and stay with her sister, family members in Iowa, fell in love with their dry cleaner. And so every 6 weeks, she would ship her dry cleaning to Iowa. And every 6 weeks, it would arrive back either in Southbridge or in Boston, depending on where they were staying at the time. But it's a great example of really that no expense could be spared to take care of like the simplest of things of like not bothering to have your dry cleaning done in Boston where you live, or in Southbridge, or even in Sturbridge, where there was probably a dry cleaner as well. She had her sent to Iowa to be done.
Well, I told you Southbridge history was interesting, right?
Yeah.
Not to continue to poop all over the Wells family, but a lot of what makes it so interesting is this incredible company, this family, all the companies, but this one in particular has like a lot of global importance. I've become really fascinated with one member of the Wells family in particular, Albert A.B. Wells. And you might know that his connection to Old Sturbridge Village is essential. But there's also another really crucial connection here, which I just discovered, really, Dave and I discovered in the course of this research. And me as a kind of urban historian, labor historian, it's very important because I've known all about Daniel Burnham for my whole career. The father of the City Beautiful movement, probably the most important American urban planner ever in kind of, urban design. But I didn't know his connection to Southbridge. So here's a picture of AB kind of relaxing on his porch here, and right over there. I'm sorry, there. Right, yeah. This is the house that AB and his wife Ethel Burnham Wells shared. Again, you know exactly where this is. This is a subway, right? Spectrum Health Services there. Ethel's father is Daniel Burnham, the famed urban planner, super famous in American circles. Most importantly famous because he was a Chicago native, the designer of the Chicago World's Fair, which very, very importantly included the exhibition hall was this massive, pavilion called the White City, which was a kind of, it was an example of this kind of modern industrial utopia where people can live and work and coexist happily, filled with green spaces and exhibit halls and all these things that can make the urban industrial life less awful, right? Make it, these urban industrial cities that have been, places like Southbridge actually, that have been taken over by factories, livable places with green spaces, with clean water, with wide boulevards that display things like statues, monuments. So he was very interested in kind of making the urban industrial life, urban industrial town livable. Without question, his son-in-law was captivated by this. A.B. Wells was a trained engineer. His official title is he's a treasurer, second son in the company treasurer of American Optical. But his real passion has to be in Southbridge urban design. Now, one thing Dave didn't mention, but another thing he's kind of telling me about is that the Wells brothers, their primary income doesn't come from their salary at the AO. It comes from the landlords, property owners. So a lot of the housing that's built in Southbridge, the Wells family personally owns. So they're collecting rents. And that's certainly for the brothers who are not shareholders in the beginning, that's their number one source of income. But to say that they're, exploitative slumlords, you can't do that. Because Southbridge in about 1910, 1920 is actually a model for factory housing. It's a long time removed from the kind of horrible tenements of, say, 100 years earlier. Built by Hamilton Woolen, up and down West Street, Mill Street. But certainly the houses that were built in the Flat, for example, virtually all over town, are inspired by these ideas of A.B. and his father-in-law, Daniel Burnham. A famous quote from Daniel Burnham, hung on a plaque in A.B.'s wall. Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood. Make big plans, aim high and hope and work, remembering that a noble, logical diagram once recorded will never die. But long after we are gone will be a living fame. A.B., his father-in-law, Daniel Burnham, and Ethel also famously went all over the place. First they went to Europe, collecting hand-wrought tools, and then kind of A.B. becomes obsessed, literally, with antique things, crafts, tools mostly, and he builds all of these barns that run off the house, which is now where you see things like Subway, for example. Those are barns built by the Wellses to house his massive antique collection, which becomes the basis of Old Sturbridge Village and the collection of the Wells Historical Society.
Joe, can I kick in a little bit?
Yes.
Back there. H.U. Bale was a local contractor who built stuff all over town.
Yeah.
But some of the Wells' housing developments was Crystal Street, Benefit Street,
Yep.
Dean Street, all that section down there across from
Yeah.
the arrow. And that's historic. That's a very historic
I
district.
totally agree. Hold that thought, you'd like to see some of those places.
Okay, all right.
Hey,
No,
Joe,
we're on the same page here.
Joe, I'm going to interrupt you. Our family has a connection to the Chicago World's Fair. Our grandmother, John and myself, Sophia Benvenuti, they came to the United States to do statues for the
Oh, wow.
Chicago World's Fair.
Awesome.
So our
Yeah.
grandmother, being very Italian, was actually born, she was from Tuscany, was actually born in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
But that they
Yeah.
went back to Italy,
Yep.
so she was an American citizen, but didn't really speak that much English. And then, of course, she came here.
That's
married
amazing,
David,
yeah.
and then she married David Lenti.
Good. That's why we're here for that.
There's a connection with our family to the Chicago World's Fair, so this is very interesting.
Oh, yeah. Well, that
White
little-
City, White City, wasn't that famous for the most extensive electric lighting display?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Up to that point.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1893.
Yeah.
It's a great book. What is it called? The Devil in the White
Devil
City.
in the White City
Yeah.
by Eric Larson.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is literally why we're here, to kind of talk to people and get more of these amazing true tales, right? So classic picture again, found in some of the great Celtic histories that already exist.
Beautiful coming out with that.
This is exactly where John and Sylvia were talking about, right? This is the quote flat, right? there would have been Crystal Street, Benefit, the East Street. Walking distance to the plant, of course. But the Wells family is involved in all kinds of worker housing. Worker housing kind of evolves over the years. Oops. Here's a really cool picture of a house right down the street, 70 to 72 Main, built in 1894, owned by George W. Wells. The Wells family estate would have been right over there on what is Dresser Park. But this would have been a housing for middle managers, bookkeepers, and things. AB's not really, I don't think he's involved in architecture at this point, it's a little early. But he's definitely interested in making sure worker housing doesn't look like a horrible brick tenement, that it looks like a nice house, right? And that means, 3 stories is equated with poverty, working class poverty. But if it houses 3 families but looks like 2, then it has a nicer, kind of more gentle feel. So the stuff that's built in Windsor Court, which is a historic district,
That's not Windsor.
AB's hand was
That's not Windsor Court.
no.
The house on the right?
Is that Twinehurst?
This one here,
Twinehurst.
yeah.
That's Twinehurst.
And Twinehurst and Windsor Court were built almost around the exact same time.
Yeah.
7 of them.
Yeah.
It's labeled on that digital
Another
photo.
thing with
Yeah.
hiding the 3rd floor is typical New England towns, they taxed by the floor. And so if you had 3 floors, they would tax you for 3 floors. But if the assessor said, oh, it's 2.5, I'm going to just tax you for 2. So that was another benefit of hiding the fact that there was a third apartment, a 3rd house on the top level.
Not Windsor Court, Twinehurst. Okay.
It could be an old Windsor Court.
Yeah, they were very similar. Yeah.
Windsor Court's down.
It's hard to trace this. It's hard to kind of see the historical value of this. Let me show you why. Again, worker housing. This is the story of the Industrial Revolution, right? It goes from tenements, factory-owned tenements, boarding houses, typically housing segregated men and women. Worker cottages. That was kind of the Wells' first venture into this. Was housing, Maple Street, Walnut Street. These are cool districts for kind of middle-level managers where they could bring their families and still be walking distance to work.
That's another historic district.
Yeah, absolutely.
See preservation.
A little known true tale from Southbridge, which nobody really thinks about anymore. But ultimately, this culminates in 3 deckers, which is what Southbridge becomes known for, right? I think it's interesting that none of the surrounding towns have any 3 deckers, not even one. There are some 3 deckers in Webster, but not in Sturbridge, not in Charlton.
There's one in Dudley.
There is one.
I live in it.
Oh. All of my spines are, all of my awesome conclusions are totally wrong. But this is what Southbridge becomes associated with, because this is straight worker housing. But again, it's not. These aren't slums. These aren't tenements.
They're all over New.
The connection to Worcester is certainly the capital of the 3-decker. There's 6,000 of them were built in Worcester between 1880 and 1930, probably. But Southbridge doesn't have 6,000, but it certainly had hundreds. This is very cool. Quintessential 3-decker, 36 Thomas Street. The house looks almost exactly the same today. We went over there a couple days ago, took pictures. Used to be the home of Lorraine and Edward Gauthier.
Hey, I'm her daughter.
Yeah, this is being filmed. Please tell me you're filming this, right? That's me. That's them.
The Smithsonian, they came and interviewed my parents and they put it in a book
Okay.
for 3-deckers in Southbridge.
And that's a cool part of the research was this person, Janice Morrill, who wrote that piece. She's an art curator. I think she was from Georgia. She very much sees 3-deckers as kind of a piece of folk America.
Yeah.
Like an antique that was served a purpose in the past, but doesn't have any kind of modern use, right? Like AB's tools that he put into a huge collection at Old Sturbridge Village. So I actually kind of had issues with this article because it sees these things as kind of a vision of yesterday and not a modern place to live. And as kind of history lovers, we have to kind of commemorate the stuff that's around us even today. It's not just the beautiful mansions of, say, the Wells that needs to be in the registry of historic places, but 3-deckers, multifamily housing, all kinds of places like, Lenti shoe store, which was a very important a place of community building, which, things like that need to be preserved. So, just for fun, my students and I are kind of digging through this stuff. the town directory, April 1st, 1928, showed you that this was a town dominated by three-deckers. And again, this like epiphany I'm having about how French Canadians really controlled the town for most of its history. You can sift through the directory in 1928 and list the adults, not the children. And there's, what are we looking at here? 1, 2, the names that start with L. I mean, seems like every other French Canadian town had a name that started with L, right? Looking at Lacasse, La Croix, Lamontagne, Laval, La Flèche, it goes on and on.
The three assessors were French Canadian
Yes.
names.
Oh, they were? Yeah. La Valley, La Toy, La Rochelle. 10 pages of L's. Must be 95% French Canadians. The great majority of them in three-deckers in Hamilton, Mechanic, Cross Street, Thomas Street, Charlton Street, Worcester Street. So this was the kind of character of the town. Working class parents, filled with first and second generation immigrants living in these, what were high quality structures, right? Three-deckers, unfortunately, they burn a lot. That's an issue, is that they're constructed in a way that fire moves up and down the walls, and they're hard to save. They can also be they can also be destroyed by water. And you all know this story in Flood of 55, how it overwhelmingly destroys Southbridge's three-deckers. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Enough to kind of write them off the maps. What's that?
I was born in that house. It's the one house.
Stillness.
It's the one house that went down the river.
This is on the corner of
On the third floor on
North
the
Street,
right
Mechanic,
side.
yeah.
I know.
This one, yeah. That's incredible. So, I always heard about that, but I didn't realize that was it. Yeah. Incredible pictures, all documented in the Southbridge News and elsewhere. And John mentioned a good point. I never heard of H.U. Bell, but this is a French Canadian migrant, comes over in the must have been the 1880s, and gets a contract to build Notre Dame, gets a contract to build Sacred Heart, builds the A.B. Wells Mansion, designed by Burnham, built by a French Canadian immigrant, H.U. Bell. How many of you have heard of? I know my mom has. We've talked about this. Alexis Boyer. Alexis Boyer. These gravestones are almost side by side in St. Mary's, old Notre Dame Cemetery. He is a French Canadian immigrant. Him and his son, who was much more famous, he became a state senator, Alexis Boyer Jr. Alexis Boyer and Son Company builds the majority of the three-deckers in Southbridge. And undoubtedly, they're building it with kind of French Canadian design elements. The wraparound porches, these really, really cool railings. Would have been like a kind of a working class, but nice, a relatively fancy working class house you would see in Montreal in the middle of the 19th century. So there's no question. Yeah.
The French Canadian carpenters were just phenomenal craftsmen, finished work and everything. They're legendary, incredible.
Yeah. And that's, again, stories like this nobody knows. Three-deckers should be commemorated as historic places, not simply, the stuff we think of. Mansions, for example. Okay, so I can leave this open for conversation. I'm pretty much done. But something like this is why we need to commemorate working class ethnic history before it's too late, right? Typically, National Registry of Historic Places commemorates things that are old. This is old. It was old. Even a ghost sign, a sign that kind of harkens back to a long gone company, is still a historic structure that you can protect. There's grants to basically have this wall removed, for example, or moved and commemorated. So this was kind of a tragic moment, brought to my attention by my friend Joel. Thanks for ruining my day. He sent me this, texted me this picture one day, and I was thinking about this, talking to my cousin Sylvia about it for a while. Didn't do anything beyond that, and now it's gone. But there's plenty of kind of these important ethnic spaces that need to be preserved before it's too late. So.
Sylvia put up a great fight
Yes, they did.
Yes.
at the bank
Yep.
about that.
Yeah.
Probably too much.
Does anyone questions, or I'd love to hear some more kind of personal stories? Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot of things, as you all know, We've only been here 3 years. So where should we start if we want to really embrace the history of this town? What do we read? What do we look up?
John, you can take that if you want, or
At the library.
There you go.
I just want to also say I run the Optical Heritage.
Dick, thank you.
There's a lot of, we have the scale that they weigh gold on.
Yeah.
I mentioned the gold story, but there were a lot of lawsuits, there were a lot of things that went on, like the government did break up, we got sued for price fixing. That doesn't surprise me. It was a different time, but I didn't know the gold story. So, but there's a lot of history here, comes in the museum, but the libraries are a great resource. I'm on the trustees and so I support the library too.
Yeah, I'd say right at the reference center there. That's all of.
12 Crane Street, Optical Heritage.
Yeah, Dick and John kind of turned us on to things like the Quinnebog leaflets, for example, which are the Quinnebog Historical Society kind of recorded the town's history in about 1908, and that's the kind of Yankee history, right? But if you want to get into kind of the more of the kind of Irish, French, Canadian, Italian, Albanian, Polish, moving on and on into Puerto Rican, Laotian, all those migrant stories are harder to find, but they're out there. But the library is fantastic. Yeah.
We have a lot of stuff on digitized on our local history page on our website too, so you can feel free to browse. I'm the reference / adult services / So my name's Jessie, so I'm always here.
Yeah, she does a great job with the library. Great resource.
Yes.
Hi, Joe. Maureen Gullickson, nice to see you.
Oh, hey, how's it?
Fascinating. Speaking of the library, I hope that you would also include in your research the story of why this is the Jacob Edwards Library, not a Carnegie Library. And so you're probably familiar with that already. I don't know all of the details, but it's worthwhile for your students to look into. But Carnegie Libraries went up all over the United States, but not here for a very important reason. So that's where I'll leave it with you. So you can do
The
that.
trustees came out with a book 10 years ago on the 100th anniversary. And there's still a book, I think there's still prints available, so there is a history of the library that we did in 2014. I think it's still available, Jesse, I don't know if you have any.
It is, yes.
It's a good resource too.
The Amadon family, like, there's a lot of talk of the Wells family, but three families kind of get left, sometimes put aside. Is the Beecher and the Amadon family. Optical business, AO, was a family business from the very beginning, but it wasn't a Wells family business. It was a Beecher, Cole, Amadon family from the very beginning, and so mostly through marriage. But the relationship between those three families, starting in the 1826, incredibly important to creating the optical business here. So sometimes the Wells family gets a lot of credit for what happens after 1864, 1871. But I would recommend everyone look into that. The Beecher, Amadon, Cole, family connection. It's really important to remember their contributions to the optical industry as well.
Okay, yeah.
This property right here, the library, this was not here. Initially, there was a house that was here, and that house was moved to 32 Everett Street, where my husband's offices were Caprera law offices. It was moved over there so they could build the library. And so it was a private home that was, they used to move them. When we got married and moved to Southbridge, they were still moving buildings on a big truck and flatbed, and then they'd have to make sure all the telephone poles and things, the wires and things were down. And I don't think I've seen something like that in the last 40 years, but 46 years ago, they're still there. Because they moved for where County Bank, Country Bank is, that was a big house that they moved. And then there were two houses that they moved so that one of the factories could have more space. And so they moved the house, they sold the houses for $1 and moved them.
I never knew that. The house just around the corner, the blue house,
Yeah.
triple decker, that was with Southbridge Savings Bank.
Thank you, Dick. I was gonna mention that.
What's that?
That three-decker house that's kind of blue painted stucco.
Yeah,
It was where the YMCA is.
yeah, that's
That
amazing.
was moved by one team of horses.
I didn't know that.
Jacked up, and one team, I believe horses, not oxen, moved that house from over there down Foster Street.
Wow.
How they did that stuff.
And they did it quickly. I mean, it's slow, but all the work to get it all jacked up. And then they would move it, and it wasn't like days. It was just part of a day to get it moved.
That was about 1890 when that
Yeah,
happened.
yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Wow. Yeah.
What was Helen's connection? You were mentioning that three-decker in the flood. Did you have a family connection to that?
Yes, my family lived there, where they lived when I was born. And
You lived there.
I did, until I was 3
I
years
didn't know
old.
that.
And we went to Efford Street across the street.
That was my Bedroom area.
Oh, it was?
I
Yeah.
used to deliver newspapers on Mechanic Street.
The house at the top?
You have to go up all those stairs, huh?
Oh, yeah. Don't think I could do it now.
I love learning the kind of the dynamics of three-deckers in that they might have been owned by a a landlord, but eventually they would be sold to the families. And mayor and the grandmother and grandfather would be on the ground floor, and then one of their kids would be in the second floor with their family. And then maybe
None of them were on
Yeah.
the bottom floor.
Exactly.
We were above them on the
it's almost
second
always
floor.
like that, right? The grandparents on the bottom, the parents, and then a tenant could be a cousin,
Actually,
or could
we
be someone
lived
else.
in, is it your grandfather's house? Is Donato one of his grandfathers?
Yeah,
Uncle Donato?
What was he?
Is he your grandfather?
yeah.
He was my grandfather.
And that's where we lived, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so we lived in his house.
They were really proud owners, the French Canadian owners of the three-deckers. They were well kept with a lot of pride.
Were they not?
I was gonna say, like, you have all these stairs like outside like that. The house
So
that I
6
live in,
families.
what's really nice about it is, the stairs are all inside, and they're, I don't know what you call it, I'm sure there's a term for it, but they're halfway, and they make like a landing, and it's all the nice wood, and it's all pretty, it's really pretty. It's, and it just looks historic that way, it's not just outside, and
Yeah.
but I like it. It's it's really nice. Plus, you can take a break when you walk up a few stairs.
Yeah, very elegant.
And when you carry stuff up, too.
Yes, exactly. You can put stuff down and then
So, my new crop of, we call ourselves the Opticons. It's kind of a, it's not all about American Optical, although so much of history is centered around that company, but this is Luke and Emma. So I've kind of turned my love of Southbridge and my this research project into an internship for my students. So it allows me to kind of bring students and do work. So that Luke has been busy kind of digitizing these town directories. And it's Luke. Emma, I think she's uncovering the strike of '34 in Hamilton Wool, and that kind of brings down the company, right? Do you two want to tell us about yours? What are your thoughts on Southbridge? How do you like the place?
Professor Lenti has been talking about Southbridge for a long time now, and he's kind of like hyping it up, and he's like, like Southbridge is a really important town for the, for these reasons, and it's really cool because of this, and I'm like, okay, yeah, we all think our hometown's cool, but as I said a couple days ago, there really is more than meets the eye, ha ha ha, to Southbridge, and it's just, it tells the story of America, the entirety of America, on a small scale.
the stories that have been getting told for hundreds of years, you can see pieces of all of those in the history of Southbridge. And so I think it's almost like it's an incredible case study on labor migration and just life in a industrial and deindustrial society.
What do you think, Emma?
I would agree. I think Luke said it best there. Southbridge is just really unique. There's a lot of things that I feel like I should know. American Optical, the first American lens company, been the largest in the world. That's something that I feel like I should have known, and it's in this small, tiny, unassuming town in Massachusetts. It's really charming town. With Hamilton Woolen, I've been really looking into how the strikes went down. What I find really interesting is that the 3 leaders of the labor movement there were all women. Jean Gauthier was the main leader, and then she had 2, I think, a vice president and a treasurer or secretary that were also. And so it's very interesting to see like union labor leaders that are women in this town, even though the company liquidated it. It's very cool.
When I was a kid, Mechanic Street was important because of the AO. So when 5 o'clock came, people just walk to go to their different homes, Thomas Street, all of them. It was really something to see. All had work their day and they were coming by to go home.
Amazing.
Or Vital Valley's Pharmacy, parents.
That raises a good point. One of a bigger project that I would like to do with students, sure, but also the community is a kind of a virtual history walk. You don't need interpretive science as much as you need stories that are connected to kind of QR codes where you walk through the town and you have maps with pins that show historic places. For example, I'd love to work with someone like Jasmine Rivas. Jasmine does lots of things, but something she does, which is crucial to us, is that she's founded the Westville Southbridge Latino History Project. Hamilton Street is an unbelievably interesting, kind of important place in the history of this country for lots of reasons. The founding of the churches, the connection to the mills, of course, but also kind of as a place of Latino placemaking in Southbridge, and that could be easily forgotten if you kind of just assume that happens everywhere. It doesn't, right? It's a very unique story to tell, and you could kind of walk down Hamilton Street and see the sites on your phone and get videos and supplementary materials and stories. And I'd like it if community members in Southbridge could generate the stories, and they could go through the Southbridge Historical Commission and be kind of put on this, growing database of Southbridge town histories. So lots of cities do that. It requires almost no infrastructure, just needs people to do the work. And we want to do some of that.
One of the things, as somebody who moved into Southbridge, I knew nothing about New England. I left what I thought was civilization and came up here. But what struck me, I was coming into a center where the Wells family took care of the town. Their management had to live in the town. They built housing. And it wasn't a unionized thing. And that is so strikingly different from many other manufacturing areas, is that there wasn't I went to work in a hospital that was unionized. It was such a hostile environment. And it makes me think about what they had to do, but they set up all these philanthropic things that when you look at all the impact of the Wells family, it is not what you expect from a typical industrial family, as far as the responses from the people in the town, and how multicultural, how multi-ethnic. My husband told me about all the different festivals that I didn't even know any of these different ethnicities existed. I didn't know that you could know somebody's background by just their last name. You know, it was just quite an education for this little wasp to move up here and
Thank you.
and my husband loves this town. He just loves knowing the history of the town and the people that are here, and he loves being the local historian of all the different things that have happened since he was 4 years old.
Despite what happened with Hamilton Woolen and the strike of 34, where they just left town. They moved down south. My Uncle Ray always talked about how a lot to do with the Wells family. The town, without the Depression, it was known as that because the Welleses, and maybe others around, but the Welleses tried to keep somebody from every family still working. So there was still some kind of an economy going on here due to that. Their largesse, I guess, in that respect. But the note of the Hamilton Woolen strike, Sylvia didn't want me to say anything, but, and this is for Emma, apparently her grandmother, Aunt Evelyn's mother, was pretty radical, and something to do with that. And Sylvia didn't want to say anything, but I have to, it's history. There's something to talk about. Maybe you can drag stuff out of Sylvia about it.
What's extra unique about Southbridge, especially about the Great Depression, many towns were reliant on one company. What is unique about Southbridge during the Great Depression is they had multiple significant companies still operating. So you still had Hamilton Woolen up until the mid-late 1930s. But the amount of American companies that have come out of Southbridge is amazing. So, didn't even touch on like the Harvey Wells or the shot fiber optics and Central Mills, Hamilton Woolen, Russell Harrington. I mean, so for a town of this size, that bubble that was created during the Great Depression wasn't just the AO. It was the town didn't rely on just one industry, had so many different industries that kind of created this amazing bubble around it. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
This is later than your period of time that you're talking about, but when my family came over from Italy in the 50s, they all worked at American Optical. That's where they went. We didn't live far, we lived up on Woodstock Road. But that's where they all went, that's where the work was.
Paul, any question?
Todd A.O. was a movie company. Michael Todd was married to Liz Taylor, and they created the CinemaScope at the AO. Michaal Todd came to the AO and he wanted a wide-angle screen that they have, all those studios have. And Around the World in 80 Days was the first movie. But Todd A.O. made movies with that system all the way to Logan's Run, which was in the 70s, I guess, maybe the 80s.
Yeah, Dick has a great display of the Todd A.O. lens.
Sound of Music was shot with Todd A.O. And if you get the DVD, it says this movie couldn't have been made. Before the titles, it says this movie couldn't have been made without the A.O. And we were in a lot of credits like that. And even till today, there's 5 sound stages in Hollywood that are Todd A.O. sound stages where they overdub the talking. And it's still a vibrant company, so that came from Southbridge. And nobody realizes they've got these studios there. Almost every movie made, they overdubbed the voices in Todd A.O. studios still till today. Beverly Hillbillies was recorded.
Great connection. So many great, fun and funky connections to the outside world in Southbridge.
Woodstock, Connecticut was part of Southbridge.
Right.
Yeah. To this town.
Cool. Well, I think we're out of time, but we'll hang around for as long as Jesse lets us. But thanks a lot, everyone.